Hi, I'm Donna Cleveland, host and producer of Thread the Needle. I have Colin Gordon here with me today, who is a historian who authored a study on race in the Midwest. Welcome and thanks for talking with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Can you tell me a little more about you?
Yeah, so I teach American history at the University of Iowa, but I also serve as a research consultant for a state policy group and a national organization of state policy groups. And so they're the publisher of this report. So it's sort of trying to connect the historical experience of African Americans in the Midwest with current policy challenges.
Interesting. Yeah, my next question for you is going to be what made you interested in this topic?
So my core academic research is on the history of racial residential segregation in cities like St. Louis. But I'm also struck in the policy work that I do, or have been struck, by how stark the racial disparities are across the board, particularly in the upper Midwest. So we think of this as a sort of Jim Crow legacy and often focusing the national conversation on race relations in the American South. But across almost any sort of educational or economic or social measure, the disparity between Black and white Americans is starker in the upper Midwest than it is anywhere else in the country. When Money Magazine or Forbes or whatever does, where are the great places to live? They always pick like Midwestern college towns, right? Because they're overwhelmingly white, you got good healthcare systems, or, what's a good place to retire, that sort of thing. But if you look at that list of metros, they're almost all the very worst places to live if you're African American, where the racial disparities, the home ownership rates or whatever, are the starkest.
I was really interested from reading your report about the history of the Black population here and how they ended up here. And I was wondering if you could just sort of walk me through that history again.
I mean, African Americans, historically concentrated in the southern states, start to move north in what's known as the Great Migration in response to a series of factors, one of which is just the horror of living in the Jim Crow South in the wake of the Civil War. And so African Americans who can get out often do. But more importantly, the sort of opportunities offered by the urban North, particularly during World War I and again in World War II, draw African Americans out of the South and into northern cities. One of the consequences of that is that the population of those cities, the white homeowners and developers and city leaders, respond to what they view as the threat posed by the Great Migration and erect a sort of elaborate architecture of segregation. So a city like Chicago or St. Louis is much more racially segregated in the sense that African Americans live in one part of town, whites live in another, than even cities in the South.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how the segregation ends up affecting schooling, employment, health, safety, all these different areas you talked about in your report, and how that sort of begins with segregation in housing.
Segregation in housing in the urban Midwest is very stark. So if you look at any sort of aerial view or not aerial view, but any sort of map that shows the racial distribution, you'll see in any city a sort of stark line, even today, between predominantly white neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color, African American or African American and Latinx. And we have a system in which we pay for local public services largely through local property taxes, the most important of those services being schooling. So that creates a situation which guarantees that good neighborhoods get good schools and poor neighborhoods get poorly resourced schools. That, of course, just creates a dynamic by which everyone says, well, the schools in that neighborhood are not very good, so I'm not going to move there. So there's not much demand for property there, so the property values fall, and there's even less money for schools. And then the schools get bad enough that people move out. So, the residential segregation tends to sort of spiral out and affect other domains because it's the way we pay for public services. But also, when you concentrate people that are relatively poor in one part of the city, you also shape the distribution of private services. You get food deserts, for example, because grocery stores don't want to put a chain in the midst of a group of poor people. And so that creates downstream problems because then the people who live in that neighborhood have to rely, on the local gas station as a place to buy their food, and the quality of their food consumption drops, and it comes at the cost of their health. Meanwhile, things like hospitals have also left the neighborhood for the suburbs, and so they have less access to healthcare. They're also less likely to work in jobs that give them job-based healthcare coverage. And so everything begins to sort of fit together in this, interlocking system of concentrated disadvantage.
A lot of people like to think that racism isn't that bad anymore and that it's not that much of a problem. What you would say to that?
I don't think it's true. What's striking is how some of the reactions to the protests and demonstrations of the last 6 months are exactly the same that we saw in 1968, where those protesting are blamed for the conditions under which they live, like you destroyed the neighborhood kind of thing. You have a group of people who are pretty disenfranchised from political influence. And so this is one form of political influence they have, is to take to the streets, and yet it's called rioting. It's people underplay its political importance. So, there is a distressing amount of overt racism still in this country.
What do you think can help the situation?
One way in which people talk about this, which I think is a useful one, is there are two sort of broad goals. One of which is to raise the floor for everyone, what we often call sort of universalism. So a good example of that is, if we had a minimum wage that was $15 instead of $7.25, that would make a big difference for everyone, but it would make a bigger difference for those at the bottom of the labor market, right? For those who are already in low wage jobs. Another example would be Medicare for all. If everyone had health insurance, regardless of where they worked, then that would set a much higher floor of well-being for people. But then to accompany that sort of universalism, we also need some targeted policies. Because even if you raise the wage floor, for example, that's no guarantee that employers won't discriminate against workers. So within that higher wage economy, we need to lessen the ability of employers to engage in that discrimination by fully enforcing our civil rights laws and that sort of thing. And on something like housing, we need to, both sort of raise the floor for everyone, but also target those neighborhoods that have been so much left in the dust by a century of policy,